Welcome to the Light Reading Executive Spotlight Q&A. This is Light Reading's sponsored podcast series exploring the companies and the technologies that are moving the industry forward. My name is Sterling Perrin. I'm an analyst with Heavy Reading.
And I'm Rafael Francis with Ciena. I lead the metro routing and switching portfolio.
And I'm Tim Pearson. I'm VP of AI Infrastructure and SaaS Applications here at Ciena.
All right, great to be talking with both of you today. So our main topic today is coherent routing, also known as IP over DWDM historically, means the same thing. We, Heavy Reading, working with Ciena, completed a very large survey very recently. Actually, the biggest survey that I've ever been involved with on the telecommunications service provider front. 241 network operators or respondents from network operators. And today what we're going to do is just go through the findings, the highlights, and get your views about the survey and just the wider perspective. We've all been on the trade show circuit, MPLS World Congress, OFC, and then where we are today, podcasting from at Ciena Vectors in Ottawa. And I've had a chance to catch some of the demos, and you guys have been doing weeks of interacting with customers, so great to get your feedback on those as well. Before we get into the content though, maybe let's just get a little bit of background on each of you and your roles within the company. Raf, maybe start with you.
Sure. So in my role leading the product management team for this portion of the routing portfolio, I engage a lot with customers, as you indicated, Sterling, attending conferences, obviously meeting with a lot of customers face-to-face, also working with our sales teams, and we try to develop an understanding of their requirements, right? What are the market requirements? Where are our customers heading directionally with their adoption of different technologies? In my case, I'm focused on things like IP optical convergence and coherent routing within my portfolio. And so that's why, I think this survey was very important, because it enhances, our understanding of what the trends are in the industry and where customers are heading. So as we develop that understanding of the market requirements, my team and product management will work very closely with engineering and R&D to go build the next generation that meets those market needs.
All right, Tim?
Similar to Raf, my role in PLM is engaged directly with customers. I'm directly responsible for the applications that allow our customers to manage, control, and really plan out how they want to deploy their infrastructure. And as we go through this podcast, I think a lot of those elements are going to become clear in terms of the importance of not only being able to just provision IP over DWDM or coherent routing solutions, but also manage the entire life cycle.
Very true. There's the hardware and the software components, and they're both absolutely critical to the evolution. So yeah, let's just jump into some of the survey data and findings and get your thoughts. Start with coherent network evolution. We did ask, so one of the questions we asked, how extensively will the operators adopt routers and switches supporting coherent optics, essentially coherent routing architectures? 58% said they will do it extensively. It'll be a common model. An additional 37% saying it'll be, reasonably adopted through their networks. For Ciena, of course, you guys have had a switching and routing portfolio for some time. How are you thinking about and evolving your portfolio of routers with the adoption of coherent optics into them?
Yeah, it was great to see the enthusiasm in the survey responses in terms of the adoption of routers supporting coherent optics. I think more and more of our customers are recognizing the benefits in terms of cost savings, operational savings of integrating the coherent optics and thus eliminating extra equipment. So you're saving cost, you're saving power, you're saving space. In our case, we've seen the adoption accelerate considerably. So we now have 148 customers for coherent routing capabilities. And that's effectively our routers with our coherent optics. So we have many more customers using our coherent plugs, for example, in other third-party systems, and we have many more routing customers. So the 148 is really just the intersection of those two, our customers using our routers with our optics. And this is something that our portfolio, I think dating back to 2020, we, with our WaveLogic 5 Nano plugs, we started integrating the optics in our routers, supporting first 400 gig ZR, moving to 400 gig ZR Plus, which was better suited to service provider needs. So we've seen that adoption ramp with service providers, predominantly driven by ZR Plus, because they can get 500 to 800 kilometers of reach, for example. And then Ciena, we also added our own high performance modes to drive reaches and distances even greater for 400 gig. But now we've introduced, for example, our latest products that support 800 gig E capable routers, and that includes support for our newest WaveLogic 6 Nano 800 gig coherent optics. So that goes into, for example, our 8192 product. Beyond that, we have our flagship platform, the Wave Router, which takes things a step further even by supporting 1.6 terabit coherent optics with our WaveLogic 6E high-performance modem. So we're seeing that evolution from 400 gig to 800 gig, and now 1.6 terabits. In total, we have a coherent routing portfolio consisting of 17 different platforms that can support coherent optics.
Yeah, so certainly we have seen, we know it started with 400ZR in the hyperscalers, and I think to your point, it was the higher performance modes were needed in order to make this a teleco application. And as those products have gone into the market and matured, we're seeing, it is reflected in the data here, a lot more interest because the technology is a lot more applicable to the market needs.
Because they have that photonic layer, they need that better performance to work with the photonic layer.
Yeah, so we've certainly seen it come along, and good to see. I was quite surprised actually, as I mentioned yesterday in the session, the 148 customers was an eye-opener, and there are not a lot of routing vendors out there, but we are starting to hear some pretty significant numbers of customers in them. So one of the ways, we look at metro and metro aggregation and then long haul. The pluggables with ZR started very much a DCI metro application, and of course with the technologies they've evolved to more network applications. One of the questions we asked was, what is your evolution strategy? And the options being to standardize on pluggable optics in metros in aggregation, and then use the embedded in long haul. Another option was to use whatever technology is best TCO for whichever part of your network, which could actually also be a metro versus embedded split. Or the other option was to standardize on just a single technology throughout the network. 70%, the vast majority of them came in saying, we're looking to standardize on metro aggregation with coherent pluggables and leave those long haul to the embedded optics. Again, you've had many customer interactions over the past several months. Does that match the kind of traction you're seeing at this point? And are there any differences in kind of how operators have been viewing that split?
No, I think that's consistent with our understanding. I do think it's safe to say that pluggables are addressing a greater and greater proportion of the use cases because the performance is increasing. But we see from the survey results, right, that embedded optics still play a role, right, in long haul, in submarine, et cetera. And so plugs will get you far, but they won't get you everywhere, right? That's why in Ciena we have this flexible portfolio. You can deploy plugs and routers. You can deploy embedded optics in more dedicated, transponder, muxponder systems. But actually, one of the things that's unique to Ciena is we've also taken that high performance embedded modem, the WaveLogic 6E I mentioned, and we have actually integrated that into a router. And we're unique in the industry. So to complement our coherent pluggable portfolio, we also have that capability. And again, that achieves the higher reach that you need in some cases, or the spectral efficiency you need for higher performance applications. But coming back to the metro, right, and pluggables, I think where we see an inflection point, the adoption of pluggables, is the router upgrades from 100 gig to 400 gig, right? That's a lot of what's driving it. So when you just had 100 gig on routers, you were typically using non-coherent 100 gig QSFP28 optics, and those would plug into transponder or muxponder system that would then convert from your gray to your colored. Now with more and more router ports having those QSFP-DD cages, you can take that coherent pluggable, which may have been utilized in that transponder muxponder system, but now you can take that coherent pluggable and you could put it into the router and connect directly into your line system, right? So you're, again, eliminating extra equipment, saving on that cost, space, and power.
Yeah, that kind of leads into the next point. So another way we can split it up is looking at coherent pluggables. One thing that is sometimes overlooked is that, yes, they go in routers, as we talked about, as you also just mentioned, they can also be put into a transponder system, and there's
That's right.
benefits to doing that.
And we do that as well.
Yeah, and so we asked this year's survey, we asked how do they, in 3 years' time, how do operators anticipate kind of the mix of pluggables into routers versus into traditional? And it was about a 60-40 split, actually this time in favor of Coherent in IP over DWDM systems. Historically, or in the traditional systems, 40%. A couple years ago, we asked the same question. It was actually the reverse. The majority were expecting traditional systems with pluggables, and 40% in that point saying into coherent routing. But interesting, as you said, as you go through that refresh of the router, they do have an opportunity to pull the plug out of the transponder system and stick it in the router. That said, as you also indicated, there's a mix, and there will continue to be a mix of how things are deployed. That kind of brings up a management question, and Tim, we'll bring you in here as the management expert from Ciena. How does Ciena address, for your customers, managing these networks that are going to, for a long time, consist of traditional DWDM systems as well as these newer coherent routed architectures?
Yeah, your question actually nailed the challenge that Ciena is solving with our software applications. So and you and Raf were chatting about it as well. Coherent plugs are going to go into transport-oriented systems. They're going to go into coherent routers. So Ciena's looked at that and said, if you really want to drive the convergence of these solutions to hit some OpEx targets and other targets that customers might have, a single platform that allows you to plan the interface, whether it doesn't even have to be a pluggable, whether you're planning a long-haul DWDM transport infrastructure or a plug-in a router or a plug-in a transponder type system, it's the same user interface from Ciena, the same provisioning model, everything else. So that ensures that our customers don't have to have unique tools or unique systems or unique processes for the different applications. It's one tool, one process, regardless of the deployment model. And that flows through from our planning tools, whether you want to understand, what's the right technology to choose. It's the same tool for all of these things. Same tool for configuring it. Whether the platform is a Ciena platform or if it's another vendor's platform, Ciena has tools that allow you to provision the plug in multiple different vendor solutions, in multiple different configurations. Mm-hmm. And the same thing for managing those, visualizing them all on a common screen and understanding their behavior in the network. So that full life cycle of the different vendors, the different vendor plugs, the different deployment models across transponders and routers, those are all fully supported in the Ciena software suite.
Yeah, this, so interoperability, so there's single vendor and then there's multi-vendor in the anticipation, and really the need is to be multi-vendor for the operators to really adopt these longer term. So let's get into interop a little bit. There was a combination of questions, and it kind of pointed, as we were talking a little bit earlier, Tim, it kind of points to a potential contradiction. The survey showed on the one hand that operational simplicity tops the list of drivers for coherent routing, and you just talked about how the single user interface can add or give operational simplicity. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, on the challenges side, consistent operations across pluggables from multiple vendors, so these networks where it's not just Ciena pluggables but others in the mix, was listed as a top barrier, and this has come through in other surveys as well from heavy reading. This plug to router interop issue is a big one. What are you seeing as both a pluggable supplier and a router supplier, but what are you seeing as the limitations today of mixing and matching these pluggables on different routers, and kind of what do you see as the view going forward? So
maybe I'll talk about the software side of that first, Raf, and then I'll go to you for the plug interface piece. Software application, your survey actually pulled it out as well. One of the barriers to really deploying a coherent routing solution across multiple vendors is lack of common APIs from the router interfaces. So in the Ciena architecture for control software, using the Navigator platform, we can map different vendor proprietary APIs into a common information model inside of Navigator. So that's how we handle it. We definitely do try to use OpenConfig, and some router vendors have done a great job with their OpenConfig models, and it's very clean and easy to integrate that. Others, maybe it's because it's an older software release that the customer has, or they haven't quite implemented all the standards yet. You do have to use some of the vendor proprietary APIs. You've got to be able to accommodate that, right? That can't be the barrier your platform has to be able to accommodate that, and that's the approach that Ciena has taken on the software side. So once it's inside that common information model inside Navigator, then all the same planning tools would apply as if it were a native Ciena device.
Okay.
So it's very straightforward for the customer.
Are you doing much of that today, or would you say the dominant deployment is really, single vendor?
The dominant deployment model is absolutely multi-vendor.
Really?
That's
Even
a great
today?
question.
Okay.
Even today. So all the customer proof of concepts we've done, we've probably done over 30 just this year, have been multi-vendor on the router side, sometimes multi-vendor on the optical side as well, different vendor transponders. And that's what customers are looking for. They're looking to because in their real network, this is what they need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
No,
So they're coming forward with the requirement that says, this is what I really need, and you as an industry, you as a supplier, show me what you've got to support my real need, not just a point solution that talks to your own products. Because I moved beyond that as a customer. I want to see the multi-vendor piece. Show me that.
Yep.
Absolutely, great question.
Yeah, and that was well represented here at Vectors. We haven't talked much about Vectors, but of course we're here in our Ottawa campus where we're having a month-long customer event, hosting customers through the latest and greatest demonstrations, and exactly what Tim is talking about has been showcased here. We've shown simplified provisioning, multi-layer provisioning of routers and optics, right? And we show both our Coherent plugs and third-party routers in the provisioning workflow, as well as our Coherent plugs in our own routers. And you can see, as Tim said, the look and feel, the workflow, everything's the same. It's consistent, whether it's our router, another vendor's router, whether it's a 400 gig pluggable, an 800 gig pluggable, a high-performance embedded optic. So customers really love the level of automation that we brought, because that would typically have been a two-stage process, right? The optical engineer provisions the photonic service, and then separately the IP team goes and provisions the router. And there's a lot of room for manual handoffs and mistakes, but that automation is key. Customers think that's huge.
Yeah, great. As you said, we're here at Vectors. I caught the demos yesterday, including on the simplified front to the point in the survey where people are looking to simplify operations, the ability to provision the pluggable in a router through an optical layer, but really kind of remove all the complexity of the the amplifiers and the spans through provisioning to end to end, which is of course essential for certain operators for sure that may have, or people within them that are deploying that have less expertise on the optical side, which continues to be and probably always will be an issue of you've got your IP folks and your optical folks, and this trend is kind of cramming them all together, and you got to figure out how to do it.
That's the thing, right? It's great to combine optics and routing because you save cost and things that we've talked about, operational simplicity, but you have to make sure that you didn't complicate things for the IP engineer, because they now have to understand some optical things, but you also don't want to shortchange the optical engineer that needs all those rich capabilities. Yeah.
Great. Let's jump into 800 gig. You've alluded to it a little bit already, and we see, and in the survey showed, kind of two sides to that. There's the 800 gig on the ports on the routers and adoption of those, and then the other is the pluggables themselves, the 800 gig pluggables in the various modes of doing that. And so we did ask two separate types of questions, one on the router side, asking when operators expect to deploy 800 gig router ports in their network, and it was surprising to me at least that pretty high percentage, 23% in the survey said they're deploying 800 gig capable routers today. Still a very high percentage as well are in the evaluation stage, which you would expect, but I kind of keyed in on the fact that people are moving to these capable routers today. Is that what Ciena is seeing, and has anything at Vectors kind of changed how you guys are viewing deployment of the routers that are capable of 800 gig?
Yeah, for sure. Now, we see that 800 gig capable routers are available. We introduced our 8192. We launched that earlier this year. And I think if you look at 800 gig from a number of different perspectives, it could be the standardization of it, in the standards organizations, the ecosystem of vendors, the economics of 800 gig, all these things point to greater adoption, potentially even faster adoption than what we saw with 400 gig. We'll have to see how that plays out. But I think, My interpretation of the survey results, we do see activity, we do see interest with customers deploying 800 gig routers in labs, in some cases in production. But I think by and large, we're talking about 400 gig today, maybe some introduction of 800 gig in live networks. I think what is certain, though, is that when customers are making large investment decisions, they're going to choose a router that's 800 gig capable, right, to ensure it's future-proof. Even if what they're deploying today is predominantly 400 gig, they'll choose a router that can get them there, right, to 800 gig. So I think that's our interpretation of those results, and that's something that we're looking forward to taking our customers to that next level.
Yeah, no, I agree. I kind of keyed in myself on the capability and it is, if you're going to do a router refresh in your network, you're going to want to be ready for 800 gig when it comes. I absolutely agree, and I've had many discussions with operators and vendors. 400 gig is the currency in telecom. We know hyperscalers are going 800, 1.6T, 3.2T, and all that. But the telcos I talk to say we really want to get 400 gig into our network in the near term. But the router data, to me, is pointing towards, when going forward, you need to be ready. And it's good to know that 800 gig is an option in pluggable form factor to do that, which is the next area we asked about. When they expect to deploy 800 gig coherent pluggables in their networks. And, probably somewhat surprising as well, 43% expecting by the end of this year, 2025, to begin deployments of 800 gig. Again, a large component also, evaluating its brand new technology, but they are commercially available now. For IP over DWDM, actually being deployed in 800 gig, not just capable routers, but the components, the pluggables. Are you seeing demand now, or do you feel the survey was kind of overly aggressive? Or
we are starting to see demand. We introduced our WaveLogic 6N 800 gig capable pluggable. We also just participated at OFC in the OIF multi-vendor interoperability test.
Yeah, I was there as well.
In 2025. And we had our 8192 800 gig capable router there, and we hosted a variety of different plugs, 400 gig, 800 gig coherent plugs from different vendors. So we talked about multi-vendor interoperability. One of the keys to that on the router and plug space is, of course, CMIS compliance, which is driven by the OIF. So that was key to that interoperability plug fest, and everything that was showcased there. And I think, Tim, we also had Navigator that was deployed in that.
Yeah, for the first time at OFC, the OIF team actually had a number of different management platforms. So Ciena was there, a couple other vendors were there, and they're actually using that to show, look, CMIS is not just an interoperability specification. It also helps drive what the customer can see in terms of PMs and alarms and all those kinds of things. And it was, I think, really useful for customers to start seeing, oh yes, this is not just a standard, it's not just a specification to put the plug in the box. It actually drives a lot of the information that shows up and is useful at the management layer.
Yeah, the plug to router interop had become the top challenge, and I've also done a lot of work with OIF on CMIS specifically, and agree, that's a very, standards are, there's lots of them, and some are more important than others, but that one is seen as absolutely essential to carrier adoption of the technology, and it was good. I saw that demo as well with the different interfaces. All right, yeah. So let's get into some of the CMIS is an element of management, and then there's just overall network management. So there's the node management and the network. Network management is also a key challenge that's been identified, and we asked about it in the survey. So we've asked this question in different iterations and in different surveys. And this time we asked, what's your preferred strategy for managing coherent pluggable optics, with the options being the optical controller, an IP controller, a hierarchical controller, or no controller at all? And I was surprised, and Tim, we'll let you come in here as the management expert, but I was surprised in this particular survey, optical controller actually was the top choice, 38%. And the reason I was surprised is that in past surveys, that has not been the top choice. So for me, it was a surprise, but I don't know, from what you're seeing in your discussions, maybe not a surprise. What do you think?
Yeah. I think what you're seeing in the 38% is really the maturation of the deployment of coherent routing from, I can just put a plug in a router and turn it up and have it run over a photonic line, and that's a sort of a proof of concept idea or a very low volume deployment, to now moving it into production. When you move into production in any sort of meaningful way, you need tools and processes that support that. And Ciena provides and a complete set of tools to allow you to plan. So you need to be able to plan these things. You need to take a look at the photonic line that's also got other wavelengths on it from other devices, and you need to plan those routes for those coherent plugs across that photonic infrastructure. So the planning team's going to do that. They've been doing it historically for optical, so now they're taking over that responsibility and also doing it for the coherent plugs. And then if you look at the overall management of the solution, the team that's going to be looking and managing all those wavelengths and understanding network impacts to all those waves, whether they started on a coherent routing plug or some other DWDM device, that's the optical team. So I think that's probably going to drive the optical numbers a little bit higher going forwards, because as you roll these things out, the tools and processes for managing this infrastructure really reside within the optical team.
Yeah, so you think it's more a factor of, as the operators get more mature and familiar with deploying, moving into commercial, that's why they're gravitating to the optical controller as the...
It's where once you get to volume, you need the support of the expertise and the use of the tools. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, there is a second piece to this, which, IP controllers.
Yep.
Were tagged in your survey as being something that was, again, a common choice.
Yes.
Ciena absolutely recognizes that. So I spoke earlier about the tools and the processes. Ciena has actually developed a different set of tools for customers who just want to use IP control solutions. They're still planning, but they're a simplified version of planning tools really focused on coherent plugs, right? Earlier message around, yes, they are multi-vendor, so our plug tools will support multi-vendor plugs, as well as Ciena plugs. You can plan those over the photonic infrastructure. You can see how they're going to flow, and it gives you all the same capabilities you would have as if you were an optical planner, but in a much simpler way, much simpler user interface. So absolutely IP controllers will be used. I would point out that Navigator is actually a very good IP controller if you wish to use it that way.
So it can have different
personalities, depending on what the underlying network infrastructure is. But it's different tools for different levels of expertise, different capability sets, and really where you're starting from. I think that's what's going to drive the controller.
Yeah. So what do you think? So the other one in the survey that came out very high, pretty almost statistically probably pretty much tied with optical, and in past surveys had been the top choice was the hierarchical controller, and we know that TIP Telecom Infra project, their white papers are positioning that as the way to manage these networks. Just what are Ciena's views on the hierarchical control? You didn't mention it as one. It's coming up third. So is it a bad choice?
It's not a bad choice. It really depends on the deployed infrastructure that you've got. So let's imagine for a moment a customer that's got 3 different optical vendors, 3 different router vendors, and they're trying to get to that agility and simplicity goal that has been identified for coherent routing, coherent plugs. What's the best way to get there? Well, in some cases, it may be that a single controller that speaks to all those subtending controllers for all those devices that aggregates that information into a common user interface might be the right solution for that sort of complex network. Mm-hmm. Now, there's downsides to that solution in that you're having to do the integration of those controllers into that hierarchical controller.
Right.
So there's a bit of an integration effort and probably a timing solution there, but it does achieve that ultimate goal that once you've got that hierarchical controller, you've got that simplified user interface. Now, from a Ciena perspective, we can also play the role of the hierarchical controller.
I was going to ask.
Right?
Yeah.
So yes, via tapping interfaces into the other controllers or just integrating whatever native APIs they have, you can actually achieve that same goal in Navigator. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple reasons why you might want to choose a hierarchical controller. I would suggest that for most customers, trying to avoid that solution and drive the control as close to the hardware as possible will give you the best velocity, but that's not always the only driver.
Okay, interesting. And we're probably getting close to the end. I did want to, we've talked about openness throughout from a hardware and software side, and maybe with respect to the controller discussion, if you could talk to the role of openness in how network operators adopt their controllers.
Fundamental to the deployment of a control solution is that it must be open. We spoke earlier about coherent routing is inherently a multi-vendor solution, not only from the routing platform perspective, but also the different plug vendors that can go in there. Your control platform has to be able to accommodate all those different solutions, right? Not just from the planning perspective, but also the provisioning as well as the lifecycle management of that. So being able to easily integrate multiple vendors at multiple levels is extremely important, and that's something we have accomplished in Navigator with the common information model we use inside the platform. So once we've mapped whatever the vendor-specific information is to the data model inside Navigator, all the higher layer applications, provisioning, monitoring, all those things work as if it were a native Ciena device.
Okay.
So I think that's absolutely critical to get to where customers want to go to.
Is there, for that issue, the open controller, is there a specific standards group or a combination of standards group that are most important for Ciena that you've aligned with?
And I'll bring Raf into this discussion as well. But for the management and control piece, I would say we certainly do look at TIP, right, for architectural pieces. IETF, very important.
Yep.
And of course, OIF.
Yes, right.
I think those are three big ones. Raf, would you add any others to the list?
No, I would agree with that. I mean, those are the key standards organizations to look at. I think you've covered it.
Okay.
Those are
Thanks.
yeah. It's good not to have too many. Great. Let's wrap up here. Before we close, though, any last thoughts or tips? You guys have been in this for quite some time. The numbers are good, 148, and some big numbers from others, but we are still early for telecom. So a lot of them are still just getting started. Any thoughts or tips for those that are just starting to get into the coherent routing? Maybe start with you, Raf, and Tim, let you close.
Sure. Yeah, I would say every network, every situation is different. So look at the integration of coherent optics and routers. Look at what it does for you in terms of cost savings, space savings, power savings. Look at the evolution. Make sure you have a path from 400 gig to 800 gig to higher speeds like 1.6 terabits and beyond, right? Make sure you're investing in a solution that gets you there. And then just as importantly, or perhaps more importantly, make sure the operational tools are there to help you along the way. So if you do it right, you should achieve significant operational savings, right? But make sure that the tools are there such that when you add the optics into the router, you're not overcomplicating things for your IP engineer, right? Or make sure that your optical engineer isn't losing a bunch of functionality that they had when they deployed dedicated optical transport equipment. So. And by all means, reach out to Ciena and let us help you on that journey.
All right, Tim?
Okay. I'm going to pick up on the evolution theme that Raf mentioned. As you think about deploying, coherent routing, plugs-in routers, those sorts of technologies and capabilities, you absolutely need the platform lifecycle piece that Raf talked about. But I would encourage people to also think about the application lifecycle. So it's not just about can I deploy the plug in the router. It's when I want to move to AI tools, when I want to move to AI ops, right? How does the control architecture I've put in place allow me to scale and move to that next level of sophistication, which is going to give me that next level of operational simplicity. And I think making the right choices now will really set up customers really well for that next step, which may be 2 to 3 years down the road.
Yeah, simple, open, and efficient. Let's close out here. For our listeners, if you're hearing this podcast series for the first time, you can check out other podcasts at the Light Reading website, which is www.lightreading.com. And I want to thank both Tim and Raf for your insights and thoughts today. And it's been great to join you guys and everyone else at Ciena at Vectors this year. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sterling.
All right.